Thank you for being here. I am so excited. I've been looking forward to this for a while because I was Ashleigh's colleague when she first started writing this book. And so I got to see it in different stages, and it's so good. And so it's a pleasure to be at this point where it's here and to be in conversation with someone who I admire and respect, but who I love. She's just a great human, in addition to being a great scholar. All right, so Dr. Ashleigh Green-Wade is Assistant Professor of Digital Studies, jointly appointed in Media Studies and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. Her work traverses the fields of Black girlhood studies, digital and visual media studies, Black feminist theory, and digital humanities. She's been published in multiple different places, but she is here to talk to us today about Black Girl Autopoetics, recently released just last month from Duke University Press, which explores the role of Black girls' digital practices in documenting and preserving everyday Black life. It's been well reviewed in scholarly and public outlets such as Ms. Magazine and New York Amsterdam News. And Dr. Catherine Knight Steele, whose own book, Digital Black Feminism, won the NCA Diamond Anniversary Book Award, says that Black Girl Autopoetics is, quote, a must-read for anyone invested in reimagining our digital future. And I cannot agree more. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Dr. Ashleigh Green-Wade.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Townsell, for that wonderful introduction. This is actually my first time visiting the state of Washington and Seattle and University of Washington, so I'm really happy that I have a chance to visit a new place and to talk with new people about my book project, Black Girl Autopoetics, Agency in Everyday Digital Practice. And so I always like to begin discussions of the book with explaining a little bit about how I came to this research in the first place. So my first job out of undergrad was as an English teacher at the high school that I attended for 9th and 10th grades. And like a lot of first-year teachers, I was very underprepared, especially because I had not originally intended to pursue a career in K through 12 education. But I had passion and I was excited about my students, and that's what matters, right? But it wasn't. That school year was one of the hardest years I've ever had. And that job was one of the most challenging ones that I've ever had. And when it was time to renew contracts for the next academic year, I resigned with no solid plan for what I would do next. But I knew that I did not want to teach high school ever again, until I did end up teaching high school again. So after finishing my master's degree, I ended up getting another job teaching, but it was in a different city, in a different state, a different type of school. It was an all-girls independent school. And so I thought that maybe my experience would be a little different this time because of a new environment. My first classroom at this new school was in the basement of the main building. There were windows, but they only looked out to the concrete structures of the first floor. To say that I did not like the location of my classroom would be an understatement. But it became a somewhat sacred space for the students who frequented it. In that first year, I had 3 Black students, all in the same section of 9th grade English. One of them ended up becoming my advisee, and the other 2 visited my classroom often enough that I acted as an unofficial advisor and school mom for both of them as well. They came to my classroom at least once a day outside of instructional time, And they continued this visitation long after they moved through ninth grade. So the whole time that they were, in high school, they would come to my classroom every day. And while I expected to have and maintain connections with students in my classes, I began to notice that Black girls I didn't even teach would come and visit me in my classroom at least a few times a week, sometimes multiple times in a day. And so we used to have this event at the school called Friends and Family Day, and one of these students who I didn't teach at the time introduced me to her grandfather. And he was, talking to us, and he asked his granddaughter, he was like, "Oh, so how do you know Miss Wade?" And he was like, "Is she your teacher?" And she was like, "No." And he was like, "Well, how do you know each other?" And she's like, "We're just Black." Like, that's how we know each other. And so she did actually end up taking a class with me in her senior year, but I had gotten to know her all throughout high school before she took that class with me. And so one thing I'll note, though, is that girls of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds did come to my basement classroom a lot. I taught ninth grade, and that is a critical period of transition, and many students found my laid-back, nurturing approach comforting. But the Black girls' visits were specific to their experiences as Black girls. Their reasons for needing to be comforted or consoled or calmed down were different from their non-Black peers. Not only were their motivations for visiting me different from the other girls, but they also had a specific manner of visiting. For instance, the Black girls almost always shut the door when they came in to talk to me, especially if they wanted to talk about something that wasn't related to school or class. Another difference is that they would usually visit me in pairs or in groups, and they kept their voices low oftentimes, which led me to think of my classroom as a kind of hush harbor for the school's Black girls. And so my classroom became a place where Black girls would come hang out with me. Sometimes we talked about their frustrations, but it wasn't always, conversations about bad things. We also would talk about the latest music or watch funny YouTube videos or dance. They taught me how to do the wobble for my wedding reception and laugh at memes. All of these interactions helped cultivate a bond between the girls and me. But what really made me become more interested in their digital practices and their digital interactions was the launch of Snapchat, which happened during the same year that I started teaching at this school. And so whenever we would talk, Snapchat would come up in the conversations. Like, they were always talking to me about things that they were seeing on Snapchat or things that them and their friends were doing on Snapchat, but they never showed me like anything, that they posted. And so when I juxtaposed this kind of open secrecy that they maintained in the stories they would share with the way that they hid what they actually did on Snapchat, I began to wonder about the role of Snapchat and social media more broadly in offering ways for Black girls to have spaces where they could just simply be without the pressure to placate others' anxieties or misunderstandings of who they are. And so years of collaborating and studying with Black girls birthed Black Girl Autopoetics. The book focuses on secondary school-age Black girls in the United States and deploys ethnography and media analysis to offer an account of Black girls' everyday digital practices, what their digital content reveals about their everyday experiences, and how their digital productions contribute to a broader record of Black life. Throughout the book, I weave together a series of stories about how Black girls create spaces and discourse through their digital content. And I present these stories as a provocation to reevaluate processes that are integral to Black life, such as space making, archiving, representation, and organizing through the lens of Black girlhood. In doing this, I argue that Black girls' digital practices comprise a means through which they invent and reinvent themselves, in turn inventing and reinventing what it means to live, create, and preserve Black life. So before I talk about specific examples of how Black girls tell their stories through digital content, I want to spend a little bit of time defining the term Black girl autopoetics. I define Black girl autopoetics as a means of creation. In breaking down autopoetics to its roots, the word translates to self-making. And I use the concept of self-making in two ways. First, Black girls making themselves or making their subjectivities. And second, Black girls staking claim to a creative process that is their own, or making for themselves. I define Black girl autopoetics as a praxis of creation because it encompasses how Black girls invent and reinvent cultural products, spaces, and discourses in their subjective formation and expression. And as a tool of creation and preservation, Black girl autopoetics empowers Black girls to construct narratives of their everyday experiences. Their digital content, especially on image-based platforms, often functions as evidence of their social interactions, and it's also a way for Black girls to show their lives. With this preface, today's talk will focus on ethnographic research I did with girls in Richmond, Virginia. And so you may be wondering, why Richmond? So there are three main reasons that I chose Richmond as a site, or one of the sites for the ethnographic research for this work. First, Richmond has historically been a center of Black cultural production, and it has emerged as a Southern urban arts hub in its own right. And because of Richmond's status as an art city, there are several youth-serving organizations in the area that provided a good starting point for me to find Black girls to talk about their everyday lives and their digital content. Second, I wanted to center the South more prominently in conversations about youth and digital technologies, since most Black Americans still live in the South. With the exception of Atlanta, much of the current scholarship about Black youth and digital media focuses on urban areas outside of the South. These are both important reasons for looking at Richmond, but the third and maybe main reason I wanted to talk to girls in Richmond is because of my ties to the city. Working as a teacher in Richmond made me keenly aware of commonalities in Black girls' experiences of restriction, especially in school settings, even when they had access to resources that people claimed would solve all of the problems that girls had in public schools. So in a way, choosing Richmond as a research site was also about going back to the place that set me on the path to learn more about Black girls' digital practices in order to make sense of their experiences within broader sociocultural contexts. The bond that I built with Black girls in Richmond inspired me to return to have more conversations with them outside of my own speculations about their lives in and out of school. One component of my ethnographic research included participant observation, which involved volunteer teaching at a high school I refer to as Liberty Prep, located in Richmond's East End. I also held discussions with two small groups of Black girls who attended various middle schools and high schools throughout Richmond. And during the sessions, we discussed the kinds of things girls like to post on social media, what draws them to certain platforms, and what they want people to know about them based on their social media content. And finally, in addition to these more formalized methods, I met with a Black girl affinity group at an independent school in Richmond, which I refer to as West Academy, where I served as a guest speaker for one of their monthly meetings. And so using these interactions as a case study, the first chapter of the book explores the space-making components of Black girl autopoetics And I argue that Black girls' digital content functions as a map of the interconnected and multi-layered spatialities they must navigate and create in ongoing processes of self-development and meaning-making. So, Black feminist approaches to geography highlight space-making as a central and necessary component of Blackness. Given the imbrication of Blackness and geography, grappling with Black girls' relationship to space is crucial to understanding how Black girlhood operates. Black girl cartographers, to use Tamara Butler's term, theorize space as intrinsically multidimensional and porous. In alignment with geographical analyses that understand Black girls' spatialities as collective, creative, transformative, and subversive, Black girl autopoetics shows how Black girls' geographies are multi-layered, traversing physical, conceptual, and digital spaces. So when I refer to physical space in my discussion of Black girl autopoetics, I'm talking about cities and their topographies, land, buildings, waterways, etc. These are spaces that touch the physical body and or spaces where people experience the physicality of their bodies. In the United States, couplings of restrictions and over-policing often characterize Black girls' physical worlds. And while most American children are subject to restrictions on their movement in public spaces, the perceived transgression of these restrictions have dire material consequences like suspension and expulsion from school for Black girls. And even outside of school context, Black girls and women who are seen as inappropriately occupying public spaces are subject to physical violence at rates much higher than their white counterparts. Inextricably linked to Black girls' experiences of the physical, conceptual space refers to worldviews and self-perceptions. And in the text, I draw from Lakeisha Simmons' theorization of mental mapping to think about conceptual space. In her discussion of Black children growing up in segregated New Orleans, Simmons explains how Black children developed mental maps, which were, quote, multi-layered and fragmented conceptual scales of the city and its buildings, streets, ecology, play areas, and people imperfectly meshed together. Unlike many standard geographical maps, children's mental maps are not to scale, nor do they correspond neatly with cartographers' mappings of the city. Instead, they reflect children's own experiences, their cognitive development, and their growing sense of the world around them. So in my explanation of Black girls' spatial layers, conceptual space comprises the terrain of the mental map. The conceptual space blends memory, knowledge, and meaning making, where Black girls store what they've learned and use those lessons to inform how they move through the world. The third layer of space that I discuss is digital space, which includes the internet and technological platforms whose functionality relies on internet affordances. In my conceptualization of the digital, space is not a metaphor, as the internet contains visual and textual content that both has its own materiality and represents the materiality of its subjects. In addition to the presence of material content, how people use the digital also determines its spatiality. For instance, the use of social media to establish networks constitutes one way in which digital spatiality manifests. And while early champions of digital utopias view the internet as a disembodied experience, digital spaces do not transcend embodiment. Instead, embodiment registers differently in digital spaces than it does in physical spaces. Therefore, Black girls' experiences in online social networks mirror their embodied experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. In this way, Black girls' digital worlds are not free from limitations, but the digital spaces allow for different kinds of movement. So Black girls' digital, physical, and conceptual worlds merge together. Their digital content and practices not only demonstrate how these spaces overlap, but also render the borders within digital, physical, and conceptual fictitious, which in turn further falsifies this dichotomy between online and in real life. The spatial nature of Black girlhood allows Black girls to exercise their creativity as space makers, forcing them to make critical decisions about which spaces they should or should not enter, and how to best navigate precarious yet unavoidable spaces. These acts of mapping speak to both the multidimensionality and fluidity of Black girls' geographies, and attending to the complexities of Black girls' spatialities is essential to positioning them as theorists within discourses of Black girlhood. So even though the theories that I flesh out in Black Girl Autopoetics allow us to think about Black girls' subjectivities far beyond their roles as students, my ethnographic research with Black girls in schools really helped elucidate this digital, physical, conceptual layering that I talk about with Black girls' geographies. And so there were two schools in particular that allowed me to understand these interconnected layers of Black girls' lives, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Liberty Prep and West Academy. In many ways, Liberty Prep embodies the sociocultural dynamics of East End Richmond, the high schools in East End Richmond, both in terms of its location and its physical surroundings, as well as the demographics of the students. So Liberty Prep was, or is, a small two-story building located squarely within a residential neighborhood. There are houses and apartments in immediate walking distance, but no places for students who might be running late to grab a quick snack or a meal. The school's main doors of entry and exit remain locked at all times, and visitors have to wait outside until one of the school's designated adult staff comes to open the door. At the building's entrance, the administrators had a table set up in the foyer, so there wasn't an official front office where visitors could sign in and out, and where they required students to place their cell phones in a bin before attending the morning assembly. There were 3 small classrooms that lined the hallway leading to the cafeteria, which was the assigned gathering place for students in the morning. And the second floor housed more classrooms, along with a modest computer lab and some administrative offices. As far as Liberty Prep's population, during the time I was there, all of the students were Black and from low-income households. The school personnel were mostly white, though there were 2 Black male administrators, and only 1 staff member actually lived in the neighborhood where the school was. However, Liberty Prep differed from some area schools in other ways. It was much smaller than many schools in the area, with fewer than 100 students in the whole school. And so on the one hand, this small number created more optimal classroom sizes where students could get more focused instruction, but on the other hand, the small size also created more opportunities for school personnel to infringe upon students' privacy and autonomy. The students at Liberty Prep had a keen awareness of the relationship between surveillance and discipline. They attended school in a hyper-surveillance environment and with a very invasive administrative approach. Furthermore, by virtue of where they lived, they also had experience with neighborhood surveillance by law enforcement. And so they had seen the consequences of people invading their spaces. And so I first noticed this spatial overlap between physical, digital, and conceptual with my students at Liberty Prep in their responses to surveillance and attempts to avoid punishment. So as I mentioned, they had a strict cell phone policy. So students had to put their phones in a bin at the beginning of the school day, and they could face disciplinary action like suspension for several offenses regarding their cell phones. So one, not turning them in, or accessing the phone without permission during the school day, and lying about having a cell phone to prevent turning it in. So like all of those were seen as like equal offenses that could lead to suspension. And so because of these rules, I had to ask for the girls in my class to have special permission to use their phones for our assignments, because we were talking about, the class was based on their experiences with social media and like posting on social media. And so I wanted them to be able to access their accounts during our discussion. And so when we first started using phones in the classroom, of course they had permission to go on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever social media to get content to use in our exercises. And they pretended like they forgot their screen names and passwords. And I was like, well, this is odd that you would forget the screen name and password to accounts that you use every day. And so I realized that they were trying to protect their digital spaces and content. So in this instance, the cell phone policy in the physical school environment meant that conceptually, the girls came to associate their cell phones with policing and discipline while they were at school. And administrators may have held students' phones hostage in a bin, but the digital content that they accessed through those phones was safe from the administrator's eyes. Therefore, the girls in my class were hesitant to access these profiles during class time because they didn't want to compromise these spaces that they had turned to as an escape. And so eventually, they realized that I wasn't going to try to like learn their screen names and passwords and things like that. And so they began to share a little more, but they were still very selective about what they would share. And an example of that would be so if they were talking about something that they posted, and some of their friends were in it, they wouldn't say like which friends, or like they wouldn't share the screen names of their friends who weren't in our class. So they were still they still maintained a lot of secrecy and privacy around their accounts, even though they were allowed to access them in class. And so on the flip side of that, we have West Academy. And West Academy was a completely different world. So it's situated in Richmond's West End, which is a residential area that's known for $1 million houses. Like the zip code of the West End, where this school is located, is the wealthiest zip code in Richmond. It's also close to exclusive social venues like golf courses and culture and country clubs. And the school is in walking distance from restaurants and shops, and students would frequent these places during their free periods before and after school. So while Liberty Prep's campus consists of a modest 2-story building, West Academy's campus houses multiple academic buildings, including a well-stocked library, a science building with state-of-the-art labs, and a gym with an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Along with the physical location and neighborhood of West Academy, the school culture encouraged autonomy to an extent. Of course, school personnel expected students to be responsible and to follow the established rules outlined in the student handbook. However, features of the school, like its honor code, for example, implied an expectation that students would develop and apply a sense of ethics and integrity. Furthermore, while suspensions and expulsions could and occasionally did occur at West Academy, fewer offenses were offenses that would lead to suspension or expulsion. And so this less tyrannical disciplinary approach meant that the students at West Academy could focus more on their intellectual and personal development. West Academy had so many resources and amenities that, in a way, those resources function as a motivator for students to behave as they were supposed to. And so there wasn't the need for this like hyper surveillance because there was a level of trust that was that the students experienced from the adults and administrators in the school. And so in contrast to the girls at Liberty Prep, the girls that I talked to at West Academy openly shared stories about their experiences. And so when I first was talking to this affinity group and I was explaining my research, several of them were like, "Ooh, my screen name is this on Instagram, you can follow me." And so they were very excited about the research and wanting me to look at their social media profiles, very, very open. And so I attributed this to the fact that they had different types of relationships with the adults in their school environment. So even though these relationships weren't completely devoid of power imbalances, they just operated under completely different conditions. And so these girls didn't experience surveillance in the same way, but they did have a sense of altering their social media accounts to account for the ways in which social media is kind of surveilled in general. And so one of the key factors that influenced how the girls at West Academy understood surveillance had to do with future opportunities, especially attending college. And so during my conversations with these girls, one of them explained how students who had been at West Academy since middle school received mandatory training for how to use social media before they could be issued a laptop. So this school had a one-to-one laptop program where starting in I think it's 7th grade, each student gets a laptop that's issued from the school. I mean, they pay for it in their tuition, but it's like a laptop that the school issues to them. And so during these assembly-style meetings, the computer technology instructor encouraged students to think of social media as an opportunity to brand themselves as well-rounded students in order to garner positive attention from college admissions officers and collegiate athletics personnel. Several of the girls in the group described how they took this advice to heart, and so they used their Instagram to curate images of themselves participating in community service and school-sanctioned events. A couple of the girls who were hoping to get athletic scholarships also talked about how they used their Instagram pages to compile footage from games that would look impressive to scouts and hopefully increase their chances of getting a scholarship. Even though the girls in this group didn't have the same, even though the girls in this group didn't have the same authoritative approach to surveillance that was being that was disciplinary, from the adults in the school, they still had a sense of being watched and needing to curate their social media in a particular way because of that surveillance from adults. And so instead of pushing back against the invasiveness of people scrutinizing the girls' social media accounts, the adults in these girls' lives understandably taught them to enact forms of docility by presenting themselves in certain ways online. So they still had this physical, conceptual, digital layer to their approach to surveillance, but it just showed up in a different way because of their relationship with adults in their school environment. And the other thing that I noticed about girls from West Academy was that in addition to surveillance by outsiders, they also engaged in a form of peer group scrutiny. And so when I spoke with these girls, one of them asked if I thought there would be differences between the content that they post and the content that students in the East End post. And she went on to explain that the reason why she asked about this is because when she went to public school in the East End, she posted more selfies. But once she started attending a private school, she felt like she had to post stuff that was, quote, that has puns or is witty. And several of the other girls in the group responded in agreement, noting a level of performance that goes into their Instagram posts strictly based on where they attend school. So the girls' assessment of this geographic performativity reiterates how Black girls' digital, physical, and conceptual spaces overlap. The West Academy group described how changing physical school environments influence their conceptualization of how others perceive them, which in turn shape the kinds of content they posted on social media. And additionally, this discussion showed how Black girls internalize and try to fight against stereotypes about socioeconomic status, because the implication that selfies are inferior to more witty posts, or that selfies are more acceptable content from Black girls attending public school, demonstrates how these girls have come to understand social class. And ultimately, this part of the conversation revealed the everyday pressures that Black girls face to embody, perform, and present versions of girlhood that their peers and the adults in their various social circles deem appropriate. So, another thing that I wanted to talk about from this chapter that really came from my understanding of how Black girls are trying to navigate these spaces, these interconnected physical, conceptual, digital spaces, is the concept of digital garroting. And this comes from, it draws from Catherine McKittrick's theorization of the garret. And so I talk about this as a space-making feature of Black girl autopoetics. And so digital garroting is one of many of Black girl autopoetic space-making functions, and it allows them to seal themselves off from unavoidable consequences, at least temporarily, within their multi-layered world. And so just to give a little bit more context about how Catherine McKittrick uses the garret or defines the garret, she talks about Harriet Jacobs' story from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and how Jacobs described hiding away in a garret, which is like a very small, it's not even as big as an attic, like it was a really small space at like the top of her grandmother's house. And in describing the garret, Harriet Jacobs said that it was both a place of confinement, but also a loophole of retreat. And so using this contradiction, Catherine McKittrick argues that, quote, the garret can be conceptualized as usable paradoxical space because it operates as a source of both escape and possibility. So Black girls' digital garrets maintain this paradoxical nature that's theorized by McKittrick. On the one hand, Black girls carve out digital spaces for themselves in response and relation to restrictive physical spaces. and oppressive conceptualizations like misogynoir and classism. And of course, these digital spaces are not spaces of confinement in the same physical sense as Harriet Jacobs Garrett. So I don't want to conflate the nature of enslavement with what Black girls are experiencing online. However, as mentioned elsewhere, throughout the book, Black girls' presence in digital spaces does have the potential to make them hyper-visible, which then potentially increases their exposure to violence and harassment and surveillance. And so this holds true even when Black girls carefully create private spaces that should only be accessible to a select number of people that they choose. At the same time, despite these restrictions, digital garroting allows Black girls to exercise agency within spaces designed for their demise. And one manifestation of this garroting that I talk about in the text is digital dissemblance. So according to youth media expert Dana Boyd, the most creative teens often respond to the limitations they face by experimenting with more innovative approaches to achieving privacy in order to control the social situation. So for the Black girls included in this study, girls who are keenly aware of issues of surveillance, employing tactics of digital dissemblance functions as a way of mitigating surveillance and controlling the situation. And my theorization of digital dissemblance draws directly from historian Darlene Clark Hine when she talks about cultural dissemblance. And what she describes as cultural dissemblance is a situation in which Black women created the appearance of openness and disclosure, but actually shielded the truth of their inner lives and selves from their oppressors. And so my articulation of digital dissemblance refers to Black girls' methods of maintaining a private, personal sense of self, even while participating in these public digital spaces. And contrary to technophobic narratives that describe teen media users as naive and ignorant to how things they post may travel, the Black girls in this study expressed a sense of deliberation about their content, which was evidenced by what they post and where. Across all of the groups of Black girls that I talked to, they said that they posted different kinds of content on Facebook, if they even had Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. So for the most part, the girls who had Facebook saw it as a way to connect with older family members, like aunts, uncles, cousins, former teachers. And so some of the girls said that if they did post to Facebook, they would focus on things like birthday parties or graduations, and they were careful not to use language that would offend their elders when they posted on Facebook. With Instagram and Snapchat, the main differences girls discussed between these two platforms involved the ephemeral nature of Snapchat and the archival nature of Instagram. So they liked how their Snapchat posts disappeared after a certain point. And so they said that they would post more silly content or inside jokes on Snapchat because they saw it as a space where they could be more candid. In contrast to Snapchat, Instagram's archival nature forces girls to be more selective about what they post because they don't want jokes or playful content to be misread by someone outside of their friend group. So one surveillance circumvention strategy that some of the girls discussed involved creating a Finsta, which is fake Instagram. And so even the name Finsta ties into its dissembling nature because despite it being the so-called fake Instagram account, it's actually the one where girls felt like they could be the most vulnerable and be the most real version of themselves. And so one girl explained how she posted videos wearing her bonnet on her Finsta because only her closest friends were allowed to see her in such an unpolished state. So even though it seems like Black girls put themselves out there just by virtue of being on social media, they still have ways of maintaining their inner selves or their interiority based on what they post on social media. And so, of course, these tactics of digital dissemblance don't shield Black girls or anyone from surveillance altogether, but they do show how Black girls attempt to control their environments. And so ultimately, Black girl strategies for working within and around surveillance speak to their creative praxis. While these digital practices won't fully eradicate the risk of posting content online, they do provide some sense of agential balance to situations where Black girls have little to no control. And it would be intellectually dishonest to imply that Black girls are the only ones who have reason and means to minimize surveillance and form online communities, but Black girls' deployment of digital garroting is unique to their experiences of navigating Black girlhood within and against anti-Black girl societies. And so I'll close by reading part of the conclusion from chapter 1. Reinvention lies at the heart of Black girl autopoetics. As a spatiotemporal technology, Black girl autopoetics allows Black girls to assess their surroundings and construct digital spaces of refuge based on how these digital spaces overlap with physical and conceptual spaces. Through their digital practices, the Richmond area Black girls whose stories play out in this chapter enact spatiotemporal reinvention on at least 2 levels. First, each group of girls use their lived experiences to create digital spaces that correspond to their physical and conceptual spaces. Regardless of differences in physical environment and experience-informed worldviews, the girls at Liberty Prep, West Academy, and in the discussion groups utilize social media applications to create digital spaces conducive to an expansion of autonomy and communal support. Second, the girls' methods of mapping inspire both a reorientation to space as multidimensional and a reconstruction of how maps look and function. Usually, we think of maps as a coherent, 2-dimensional visualization of space. For instance, a map of a country depicts all the states, provinces, and regions of that country on one surface. Similarly, a conceptual map might depict a writer's thought process on one sheet of paper or one collated set of papers. While Black girls' digital practices evince their multi-layered worlds, their digital content does not reflect points plotted on one unified surface. Instead, their digital productions are dispersed across various platforms. Therefore, the way Black girls map their worlds through digital content does not adhere to any established or standardized method of map making. In this sense, Black girls have created an alternate approach to cartography that adequately encapsulates the complexities of their spatial formations. Even though the Richmond area girls' spatialities were undoubtedly informed by their location, the connections between physical location, conceptual realities, and digital practices have broad implications for how we understand the digital as spatial, elucidating the complicated overlapping geographies of digital, physical, and conceptual spaces. Geography as a field has started to acknowledge the digital as a legitimate geographic subject of analysis. Still, formal and informal conversations I continue to have with people, especially those not situated in the fields of geography or digital media studies, reflect a persistent bifurcation of digital space and physical space that positions the digital as abstract or unreal. Therefore, Black girls' digital practices help to concretize spaces that are often seen as abstract in ways that obscure their material value and impact. While the digital is certainly not without rules and limitations, it provides Black girls with an outlet and opportunities for agency within contexts where so many challenges related to their schools, neighborhoods, and broader social environments seem beyond their control. As one of the discussion group participants, Tania, put it, quote, "In my opinion, I think it's better to be with technology because you don't really use paper and pen like that anymore. You use laptops, so why not just be able to get on technology when you need it instead of just when you're told," end quote. Tania's insistence on the need to use technology beyond when you're told speaks to Black girls' multi-layered social dynamics. The freedom to use digital tools beyond the scope of the classroom, which tends to be a space of restriction, allows Black girls to undermine the lack of authority they experience in a range of everyday interactions. Overall, the observations and conversations with Black girls in Richmond, Virginia, speak to how Black girls' digital practices create and expand places where they can simply be. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions, and I'll let you kind of call on people, but we can keep it informal, but I'll ask the first question. And that's for you to talk a little bit more about the ethical considerations that guided you in doing this work with girls. Which is understood as a vulnerable population. I remember being back in grad school and wanting to do work on girls, and people told me, forget about it, it'll be too hard to get through IMD. So I'm very curious as to how you negotiated that.
Yeah, so when I first started doing this research, I knew that I wanted to maintain a balance between writing a book or writing a series of stories that would help us understand Black girls while still maintaining their privacy, or while still maintaining their interiority. So the things that they wanted to keep private, I wanted to keep those things private because there was a reason why they didn't want those things out on social media, or why they posted them on their private social media accounts. And I think about an instance where, so when I taught this class at Liberty Prep, I had an audio recorder, and so I would record our class sessions. And I remember telling the girls, at any point, if you want me to pause the recorder, I will. And so there were some times when they asked me to pause it. And I remembered the conversations, but I didn't write them down in my notes, in my ethnographic notes that I was taking, because that was, a way of maintaining their interiority. So that was the main ethical consideration. And as far as dealing with the IRB, I actually added my own kind of ethical addendum, I guess, to what the IRB was requiring, because I didn't feel like what they required was good enough. It wasn't strict enough in terms of thinking about reproducing Black girls' content that they post online, because basically the IRB was well, if it's public, if it's a public social media account, then it's fair game, even if it's a child. As long as they're of age to participate on social media, meaning that, I think most social media sites have a requirement that children be 12 or 13 to participate. So as long as they're 13 and up, if they have a public social media account, the IRB is yeah, you can, post anything from that. The one stipulation that they did say though was that if there were videos or images of girls engaging in illegal activities, then I had an obligation to report that. And so I just didn't like include that kind of content in my research. And I also included a statement in the informed consent document that said, you know, if you allow me to follow you on social media, if I see something that is, you know, illegal, like you using drugs or you getting into a fight or something like that, then I have to report it. And so girls knew that before, like, sharing their accounts with me. And so, yeah, I just took extra steps to make sure that I was protecting their privacy while still telling their story. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And
on the question, thanks. On the question of informed consent, so did you explain, like, did you sit down with yourself to explain the form with it, like the conversation? Was a parent or guardian present, or did you speak from the form and then, yeah?
So that's a good question. So I did it in a couple of different ways because I had some groups of girls that I was talking with in person and then other groups of girls that I was communicating with online. So what I would do, the way that I approached it was with the girls that I was with in person, like I sat down and like went through the form with them. I explained like what consent is, and so they filled out a form of consent, and their parents did as well. So like I explained it to both them and their parents. The girls that I communicated with online, if they were, some of the girls were already 18, so they could sign their own consent forms. But if they were under 18, then I asked them to give me their parents' like contact information so that I could talk to the parents about what their daughters were participating in. And so, but I would also explain to the parents because, and this is important, that they can't make their daughters participate, because some parents would be like, oh yeah, and I'm like, you can't, like, if she doesn't want to do it or if she wants to drop out at any point, like she has the right to do that. But most of the parents were very excited about the project. And so, yeah, I did a combination of talking to the girls, but also talking to the parents, and a combination of in-person discussions and like over the phone.
One, I appreciate the language you're using on protecting their interiority and holding on to that. And I also heard you say like illegal content that wasn't included in my research. So I'm wondering too, like, aside from the stuff you were refusing to include, what else, like, what was not research? You know what I mean? What was considered maybe something else, or what other ways were you like distinguishing between this research is going to be included, whether it's in the book or it's part of RD, and then this is something else? And then how do you, I don't know if you were to protect that, but how did you think about those things?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of the way that I determined like what would be included as research and what wouldn't be was based on like the questions that I was asking. So like I started out asking how do Black girls contribute to conversations about race, gender, and sexuality through their social media. But I kind of modified that research question because Black girls that I saw weren't necessarily explicitly talking about these things in their social media content, especially with sexuality. Like most of them weren't talking about sexuality. And so I changed it to more of a broader, how are Black girls contributing to conversations about like various social issues. And so the content that I included was content that I felt like addressed different social issues. And so that's also part of the reason why I didn't include like, you know, fight videos and things like that, because that wasn't really part of the scope of my research. Also just because, and I talk about this a little bit in the introduction, there's already, I feel like, a lot of work being done or that has been done around like girls who are like at risk or who are, you know, violent or aggressive. And so I wanted to focus on expanding the story of Black girlhood a little bit and thinking about other ways that Black girls are representing themselves on these platforms. Not to say that the other stories are not important, because they are, but I feel like, you know, we just need more, you know, just more stories about Black girls' experiences. So, yeah. Yes.
So thank you for your talk. It's really super generative, really interesting to think about the kind of different layers of mapping. I was wondering too, did you see the girls mapping themselves? Like, do they, like these different kinds of platforms they're on, do they see them as one's more real than another, or one's like sort of future self, or do they sort of understand, I guess, their own identity in some ways, sort of mapping onto these different spaces?
Yeah, I think they definitely understood their identity. I don't know that they conceptualized it as mapping necessarily. I think that kind of comes more from my own analysis of what they're doing, or like the outcomes of what they're doing. But they definitely have a sense of like identity. As far as like spaces being more real than others, I don't know that they necessarily thought about it in that way, but I think it was more like all of these spaces are real spaces, but to what ends am I using this space for a particular reality? And so I talk about how I looked at these girls' accounts over a period of years. Like I saw most of them like graduate high school and like go on to college or careers. And so it's interesting to see how even in that process of growing up, how their social media changes. As with several girls, as they got closer to finishing high school, they deleted a lot of their like more social posts, like, you know, if they were at a concert or like they went to a party or something, they deleted that kind of stuff, and they replaced it with like them going to present at a conference, or, you know. And so it was interesting to see how they were interpreting their identity as like transitioning into adulthood. So I think that they saw these spaces as like real spaces, but just looking at different versions of their realities across different spaces.
So it's kind of a follow-up. Would you kind of comment a little bit more on the difference between the girls on the two sides, for example, in terms of their social media practice, like deleting posts related to something? Is there any noticeable difference between these two groups?
You mean between the
two sides, right? You have two sides, and I think that the concept of digital disassemblement that you mentioned, I was wondering whether there are differences, even just nuance differences between these two sides.
Yeah. So with the girls at Liberty Prep, it's actually kind of hard to say because they never really like let me see the things that they posted. Like we would have assignments where they would have to show like photos that were based on like certain like things. So for example, let's say when we were talking about family histories or like family stories. And so they would like show me pictures of like them with their, you know, siblings or their moms and things like that. But I never got the opportunity to actually look at their social media accounts, only the kind of like curated images that they would upload to like a Google Doc or something. So it's hard for me to say how their social media transitioned over time in comparison to the girls at West Academy. But the girls who did from West Academy who did share their stuff with me, they absolutely had like, you could see like a clear progression from like, you know, early high school to like the end of high school. And I still follow a lot of them. Like a lot of them went on to like grad school and medical school. So yeah, it would be hard to compare that transition with the girls at Liberty Prep because they actually didn't let me follow them on social media. Actually, I do follow one of them on Facebook, but because I didn't see her, the things, she followed me after she graduated, or like, you know, sent me a friend request after she graduated. So I don't know what the comparison would have been between them and now. So thank you for the question. Yes.
Do you think because you showed up at Liberty as like kind of a volunteer teacher that might have impacted the way that they were interacting as opposed to kind of like coming to like the other group style like you did with the other school? Because then it is more about like authority figure. And then second part, not related. How do you think TikTok and like more of the video-based social media platforms would come in? I haven't heard you mention that one in particular, but like do you see that as a different source altogether, like we were talking about like the ways they present themselves? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. So the first question, yes, absolutely. Like I think that because I was their teacher, it also created like a different, it just created another barrier because it was like with the other girls, I was having discussions with them, but in their mind, I was probably never going to see them. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not like I was holding some kind of authority over them, like they didn't have to participate. And the girls in my class actually didn't have to participate in the research either, but it was a little bit difficult to kind of separate the two. But so yeah, I do think that added another layer of just them wanting to protect their privacy. I did talk about this a little bit in the book about how I approached grading because it was kind of like, I didn't want to create a situation where it was like, if you're not participating in the research, that affects your grade. And so I just basically like gave them all A's, you know, like, so I talked about that as like, you know, you're gonna get an A, like just, you know, come to class, do the work, you know. But yes, I do think that them seeing me as an authority figure versus like, you know, just some guest speaker or someone who's coming in to like learn more from them definitely affected the way that they were so guarded about their content. Even though they did start to open up by the end of the semester, but that did affect it. The second question, which I'm glad you asked, the reason why I don't talk about TikTok in the book is because, well, I do talk about it a little bit, but it wasn't a primary site of research for me because it didn't come out until I was finishing up the research for this book. And so I didn't have the time or the capacity to like go back and like, you know, include it in as one of the like sources. But I do think that TikTok I think it is a different kind of social media. I was at a symposium recently and Catherine Knight Steele was talking about TikTok. And I think that her assessment is very accurate. And she was saying that like TikTok is, I mean, it's technically called social media, but it's more of a content creation site than it is social media in the way that other platforms are social media. And so I definitely think that feature of TikTok makes it different for how Black girls and teens in general are engaging with the platform because it's more, it does have social features, but they just aren't highlighted in the same way because the main goal is to create content. Yeah.
I forget that it's kind of still relatively new. Like it seems like it's been around that for a while, but not really since like the pandemic, I guess.
Yeah. And so like I was pretty much wrapping up the research during the when the pandemic first started. So yeah. Yeah, I think she.
Well, if there's no more questions, we'll end it there. Thank you so much.